because we must not stand idly by in the face of violence, I affirm resolved. The United States ought to substantially reduce its military presence in the West Asia, North Africa region. First, I'd like to provide some definitions. As per the Encyclopedia of Word Problems, military presence can be defined as military bases or organized military personnel, quote, extraterritorial military bases and intelligence centers, access to military facilities, or the presence of military personnel. And substantially means 50% or more, according to Law Insider. Substantial percentage shall mean 50% or more. Lastly, I'll abbreviate the West Asia North Africa region as the WANA region. Thus, the affirmative burden is to prove that reducing U.S. military presence in the WAJN and WANA region by at least 50% is better than the status quo. First, on the framework. The word ought in the resolution implies a moral obligation, which means the value prescribed by this resolution is morality. Thus, the criterion ought to be utilitarianism, i.e. maximizing expected well-being. Prefer it for two reasons. One, actor specificity. Policymakers must aggregate decisions because every policy benefits some and harms others, meaning that utilitarianism is the only moral framework that policymakers can use. But secondarily, every moral theory collapses to utilitarianism or it has no ethical backing, according to Peter Singer in 1993. Universal ethics compatible with universality. Universal ethics provide a persuasive reason for taking a broadly utilitarian position. This requires me to weigh interests and adopt a course of action to maximize interests. Cut the evidence of interests. First contention is conflict, because U.S. military presence incites violence. Anything beside the affirmative would lead innocent civilians in the WANA region to die. Subpoint A is terror. U.S. military presence is inherently destabilizing and supercharges terrorism, which causes hundreds of thousands of deaths. The Cato Institute is clear that, quote, neither ISIS nor Islamist-inspired terrorism represents enough of a threat to justify expansive, aggressive, and costly campaigns. Terrorist killing missions produce more problems than they solve at enormous financial cost. The right general direction for the U.S. is to reduce military intervention, suspend efforts at nation building, and efforts to dictate political outcomes. Homeland defense does not require destruction of terrorist organizations, and the U.S. should withdraw its troops from Afghanistan, Iraq, and Syria. Military intervention created chaos and resentment that fueled terrorism. Despite 15 years and enormous investment of money, efforts have produced little progress towards peace and stability. Efforts fail to stabilize the region, growth in terror and anti-American sentiment. And subpoint B is the self-fulfilling prophecy. The U.S. is actively shameful and fueling violence. The AF is the only way to stop it. English News in 2022 furthered that, quote, the U.S. seriously violates international law, including war crimes, arbitrary detention, torture, and indiscriminate sanctions in the Middle East, constituting systematic violations of human rights. Crimes led to wars, security dilemmas, and undermining rights to life, health, dignity, and religious belief. The U.S. rallied its allies to launch the Gulf, Afghanistan, and Iraq War, and so on. Also, it was involved in the Libyan and Syria war, creating a humanitarian disaster. More than 174,000 people died directly in the war in Afghanistan, 47,000 were civilians. 209,000 Iraqi civilians died, 9.2 million Iraqis became refugees. The U.S. repeatedly attacked civilians. Many airstrikes did not take precautions to distinguish targets and civilians, cut the carded civilians. And U.S. military presence is a self-fulfilling prophecy that ensures conflict. Duke Law professor Mara Revkin says that, quote, link between fears and instability and military security rather than building sustainable peace. Iran has followed through on its threat. The crisis mentality permeates the aid community's operations. I was mortified by unnecessary security measures that were expensive but also alienating. The U.S. tends to view its crises as exceptional while treating instability in Iraq as normal. One could also describe the U.S.'s conflict as cyclical. Instead of assuming the inevitability of Iraq's next crisis, aid could begin to view Iraq as a country capable of stability. This enables a reprioritization of longer-term development. And the next contention is the economy, because we should be protecting the livelihoods of our citizens, not bombing civilians. There are two subpoints. Subpoint A is national debt. U.S. military presence in West Asia, North Africa, in the region, has extremely detrimental costs that is affecting the economy right now. Writer Stephen Aftergood tells us in 2021 that, quote, the government spent $8 trillion on wars in Afghanistan, Pakistan, Iraq, and elsewhere. This total omits other expenses, macroeconomic costs to the economy, costs of not investing in alternate sectors, future interest, local and private costs. Current wars paid for by borrowing raised the budget deficit, national debt, and other macroeconomic events. And continued spending will cause a debilitating economic rut that would be near impossible to escape from, negatively impacting citizens across the country, according to Brian Rooney. Prioritizing defense undermines economic growth and resources for defense. Spending contributes to deficits. Debt will undermine growth. Debt rises, risks a deleterious effect on growth. Level of spending is not necessary for security and is unsustainable. A public health emergency, infrastructure, and public debt, reducing spending. And subpoint B is government spending. The act allows for funding to key infrastructural programs, which solves a litany of domestic issues, namely public health. According to the Brown-Watson Institute from just last year, quote, the US government is devoted to militarism. Taxpayers and policymakers should ask if this is the way we want to use our resources. The military become the only sector well-resourced enough to handle issues. Reconstruction activities pursued by the Department of Defense rather than by USAID or the Department of State. Public health emergencies such as COVID, staffed by military, diplomacy is crowded out by war. Economic reality is that there are important areas of investment in which jobs would be created rather than lost in the reduction of military budgets. And public health crises threaten human survival, Diamond is 22. Our current lifestyle is not sustainable to face the next pandemic. Pandemics threaten the human race. So, affirm today, because bullets and bombs have broken communities and families. Pen and paper can put it back together. I stand open for cross-ex.
Great. I'll get my timer. Judge, ready for cross? Great. I'll start time now. Let's talk about conflict. So where's the specific place that the US is in the region where they're increasing conflict or provoking more conflict to start?
So a lot of places. Last night, the United States executed airstrikes against Houthi rebels. That's escalating conflict. The Houthi rebels have literally declared that they will respond with force due to these airstrikes.
Okay, so how is the US fighting back against like missile airstrikes in the region a necessarily bad thing or promoting any sort of bad conflict?
Well, one, it proves that missile airstrikes happen even with military presence. But secondarily, there are lots of other places. Places like in Iraq, where the US has killed thousands of civilians, inciting conflict and anti-US sentiment.
Okay.
Yeah,
that's fine. Let's talk about your second warrant on the first contention about self-fulfilling, like being a self-fulfilling cycle. So, like, what does this actually mean when we look at the implications in the status quo? How is the US, like, fueling itself?
So it's fueling itself because when attacks happen in the Middle East, if the US is present, that's going to motivate the United States to do more against these attacks. If the US were to just pull out and treat these countries like they were actually able to handle themselves, which they very well are, it would end US conflict. We're fighting because we're there, not because the fight is necessary.
Okay, so when we withdrew presence in certain areas in the past couple of years, did we see that these countries were able to solve conflicts on their own, or was there more harm overall?
So other examples that you might bring up are necessarily unique in the way that other groups were in that country. In countries like Syria, in countries like Iraq, the US presence is unmatched by basically anybody but Russia or China, which won't fill in.
Okay, so why wouldn't Russia or China fill in? Let's get to
So
that.
a couple reasons. One, Russia is deterred by Ukraine, and China wants to focus its efforts in the SES. But also, economically, Russia has no capability. They're engaged in the Ukraine war, which means that they don't have any funding or ammunition to spare to be able to project power into the region.
Okay, that's fine. So let's talk about the second contention on national debt. So what does this argument actually look like when we're trying to pinpoint an impact scenario? Because I heard the link on pandemics, but again, like I don't really see what the link is there.
The link is taking funding away from the military allows for better funding to lots of programs, whether it be public health, whether it be education. That ensures that we're able to tackle the next pandemic better.
Okay.
And it also ensures that we're able to prevent a recession.
Okay,
because,
so
yeah.
how are you able to define where this money goes? Because you say that it would help a bunch of different programs. What's the specific impact scenario we're looking at on this contention?
Sure, even if you don't think that that works, subpoint A is talking about national debt and how military funding is actually deficit spending, and it's blowing up the national debt, which means that even if it doesn't get directed to a specific program, which our evidence suggests it would mean that debt explodes, that causes an eventual recession.
So on debt, like the YAC didn't really outline a specific impact. So what's the impact of the increased debt ceiling?
So the Rooney evidence talks about deleterious effects on growth, and that causes things like a recession, that causes people to starve, that causes livelihoods to go away.
Okay, when the deficit increased in the past couple of years and the US raised the debt ceiling, why didn't we see a recession then?
We've already had issues with the debt ceiling now, and it's not a guarantee that the debt ceiling will be raised again, but even then, deficit spending is not good anyway. It's not sustainable in any near future, and military presence contributes to that.
Okay, that's fine. I'm gonna run some prep. I'll start that now. is 209. Can you write that down?
We're doing 4 minutes, right?
4 minutes?
The
Okay.
core.
Yeah, that's great. Okay. So the order is going to be, I'm going to go down the, neg constructive and then down the neg, or app case.
I'm good with you.
Great. Everybody ready? Great. I'll start time on my first word. I negate. I'll agree with my opponent's framework and move on to my case. Negating minimizes suffering in 2 key ways. My first contention is reducing authoritarianism. U.S. military presence is essential to deterring oppressive governments in the West Asia North Africa region, and democratic backsliding in Afghanistan is a perfect example of what happens when we affirm. Moziland 23 finds that the Taliban swept back into power, threatening civil rights, restricting press freedoms, and cracking down on demonstrations as soon as the U.S. pulled out, prohibiting women from attending school and working. And the economy has shrunk by 30% since the takeover, and 90% of the population now suffers from food insecurity after the U.S. pulled out. Continued military presence protects democracy from authoritarian regimes involved in the region, such as Russia. Africa Center for Strategic Studies finds that undermining democracy has been a strategic objective of Russia's Africa policy, disrupting democratic processes through disinformation campaigns, election interference, paramilitary forces, illicit arms deals in 23 countries. Reducing U.S. military presence would cede Russia further control and prevent democratization. Zimmerman 20 finds that America's military investment in Africa helps build democracy promotion as the U.S. military enables diplomatic, political, economic, and developmental initiatives, and shrinking military presence collapses the U.S.'s foreign assistance programming, allowing Russia to recklessly expand their influence in Africa through security assistance. The impact of authoritarian influence would be devastating, creating more rights abuses, wrecking societal welfare, and dangerously increasing the suffering of a country's people, as Heyman 19 finds that Russia intentionally exploits instability in these regions to advance its own geopolitical aims. To engage in large-scale resource extraction, sanction evasions, and Kremlin-backed military private companies have been in particular exposed for human rights violations and war crimes and would be ultimately worse than the U.S. presence in the region. My second contention is protecting trade. An Iranian-backed organization known as the Houthis has been dangerously increasing attacks in the Red Sea. Time News 24 finds that multiple missiles and drones were fired in the direction of commercial vessels in the Red Sea launched from Houthi-controlled areas, and this poses a grave threat as the Houthis have begun fueling their attacks with ballistic missiles. CNN reports 2 days ago that the Houthis' most recent attack not only included 18 attack drones, but also used 2 cruise missiles and 1 anti-ship ballistic missile launched towards international shipping lanes in the southern Red Sea, where dozens of merchant vessels were traveling. Ballistic missiles are a significant threat to the region, as the National Air Intelligence Center finds that ballistic and cruise missiles present a significant threat to the U.S. overseas, which can be armed with chemical, biological, or nuclear warheads, as almost all ballistic missiles carry dangerous warheads with an explosive force enough to produce massive casualties and severely degrade military and trade operations in the region. The U.S. is crucial in defending the region through BMDs, or ballistic missile defense systems. Sullivan 23 explains that the U.S. has already directed the deployment of additional missile defense systems capable of defeating ballistic missiles to the Middle East. Throughout the region, this is used to increase force of protection and is crucial to fight back against the Houthis. Absent military presence and missile defense, Houthis have access to full trade routes with ballistic missiles, which would be devastating to international trade, as PBS reports that the Red Sea is one of the most important arteries in the global shipping system, with 1/3 of all container traffic flowing through it, and any sustained disruption in trade could send a ripple effect of higher costs for the world economy, costing more than $1 million per each round trip. This would spike inflation, as Kimball 24 reports that the fight against inflation would stall in the coming months if shipping costs push the price of goods higher, adding to consumer price inflation and having an effect on the global economy, increasing the core goods by at least 5% in the first coming months. Any increase in inflationary prices for goods would trigger a wage price spiral, which Zon 22 defines as a rise in prices prompting workers to demand raises to help them afford more expensive goods. This in turn pushes up prices even more, leading to a self-perpetuating cycle of runaway inflation. This could plunge the economy into a recession, and seeing wage growth, the Federal Reserve has to set off higher interest rates to ward off a worst-case scenario of spiraling price increases, which is the cleanest link into recession. Any risk of a global recession would devastate millions, as McKinnis 09 terminalizes that the last large global recession pushed up to 90 million people into extreme poverty around the world. To reduce mass suffering, I negate and move on to my opponent's case. As a top-shelf response, first, a Russia fill-in with increased conflict, instability, and battle for new security order in the region will ensue. That's the Weissler 19 evidence for my case, which indicates that a full U.S. withdrawal from from the Middle East means that energy resources and overall countries would be far less secure. Iran would be free to be more aggressive, and other countries would feel tempted to spark more regional conflict without the presence of the US keeping things stable, and Russia and China presence would grow as other regional actors are unconstrained to advance their own objectives. The perception of American withdrawal would be terrible, encouraging a Russian fill-in. The US is essential in the Middle East because without it, a power vacuum appears and countries fight for control, causing larger amounts of bloodshed and suffering, as Cropsey 19 finds that the United States' greatest geopolitical threats have interests in the Middle East, like Russia and China, which are both seeking to enter the region right now. The only thing keeping it stable and keeping them out of the region is US presence. When we remove US presence, we give them full control, which is dangerous in either world, which is a unique reason to vote on risk of neg. But then, go to the argument or the specific war on terrorism. First, anti-terrorism is highly effective in the status quo. Mazilur 22 finds that after 9/11, the US has been a major player in building capabilities of allies and accumulating information on terrorist cells. Military cooperation between the US and Middle East countries has advanced, and recently the US and Gulf countries have adopted successful counterterrorism strategies, especially to prevent radicalization, and Middle East terrorism-related deaths have fell by 87% since 2016 with US involvement. Intervention incomes are also successful over 60% of the time, as Sullivan 09 finds that intervention incomes have remained remarkably stable over the last 60 years, with the probability of success always hovering around 60% when a military intervention occurs. But third, US involvement deters regional war and has scaled back excess presence to more stable levels in countries and are focusing on areas like the Red Sea, where the need for US offense is crucial. That's why Reisler 21 finds that US presence that has stoked resentment in the past has now decreased from hundreds of thousands in countries like Iraq. We would say that right now, the US has a focus on protecting navigation of freedom and freedom of navigation and preventing a regional war in the Gulf and Iran's threats through their proxies like the Houthis. Third or fourth, empirics prove the US reduces conflict on net. Mahani 18 finds that overall, on average, states are less likely to break out in a regional conflict when there is US troop presence. Go to this warrant on being self-fulfilling. I would say that there's no clear impact scenario defined from this anyways, and what the US military presence does under the first contention. But regardless, the US has to be in the region to have some form of deterrence. It doesn't matter if this warranting on perpetuating more conflict in the future is shoddy at best and doesn't actually define a clear link into as to how this actually implicates into the status quo. But go to the second contention on national debts. First, on the deficit spending warrant, there hasn't been a recession in the past when we've done things that increase the deficit spending. For example, Biden began forgiving hundreds of billions of dollars in student loans, taking them straight out of the deficit, and we didn't see any increase in inflation or any sort of recession, so there's no unique reason why that happens with military presence. But also, we see that we've had military presence for a long time, and there hasn't been any sort of large-scale recession or trade-off with the things that they're talking about. But then, you can't prove where this money trades off from, and there's also no clear impact scenario defined here. You can't prove that reducing military presence would uniquely trade off with XYZ impact scenario. There are a million other things that the US could put the money towards with their governmental funds. But third, the app hurts inflation even more. That's by evidence that tells you that the price of goods would go up by so much if the Red Sea were continued to be attacked, which overall increases inflation and price of goods. But then, again, we would say that on the subpoint A about infrastructure and pandemics, we would say that, or subpoint B, pandemics have other factors and have other things that contribute to it. There's no way to pin this down to a debt ceiling increase, but also it's unlikely. And again, you can't prove where the trade-off comes from.
All right, are you open for crosshairs?
Yes.
Got it. Okay, so quote from the 1NC is that the Houthis have used 18 attack drones, cruise missiles, and anti-ship ballistic missiles, and that's with US presence. So I guess how is US military presence deterring Houthi attacks on trade if they are literally launching ballistic missiles right now at trade?
Yeah, so as my evidence indicates, the US has been focused on defense in the region, so they haven't been focused on any sort of offensive attacks. But that's why my evidence indicates from 2 days ago that they're starting to increase offensive attacks to deter things like what's happening with the Houthis. My argument is not that the US prevents any sort of conflict from ever breaking out. It's that if conflict does break out, the US is there to deter it rather than a worse actor like Russia, or they're just being like a power vacuum with no other country to help.
So last night, the United States launched offensive attacks against the Houthis. They launched ballistic missiles, and the Houthis swore that they would come back with a harder attack. How does US military presence make that go away, and how does that mean that attacks still don't happen?
Sure, so A, I'd love to see that evidence, but B, let's make a comparison of both worlds. So in a world where the US is there and the Houthis say they might increase attacks because the US is there. First, a lot of groups that are causing conflict love to use the rhetoric that the US made them do it, but the real likely scenario is that they're going to do it in either world because their interest is not to hurt the US, it's because of other things happening in the region, like the Israel conflict.
So if
Second, just really quickly, the second warranting on my evidence, we would say that right now, it's not that if the US weren't there in a world where the US pulls out, that that means Iran has full capability to launch ballistic missiles, and no other country in the region has ballistic missile defense right now. So that means we take out
So
our
the United
only
Kingdom and a lot of other countries assisted in the U.S.'s
Sure, so
attack.
the United
Why can
Kingdom-
they not also participate
Yeah,
in that sort of
so-
deterrence?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked that question. So the United Kingdom and the other coalition countries in the region, in the Red Sea trade, have like regular Navy presence and a lot of things like shoot-down missiles per se. But the only country that's actually put ballistic missile defense, which my evidence outlines specifically, is the US, and no other country has that in the region right now.
Okay, got it. Where's the warrant that China fills in, or is that an argument that's being made?
I would say just Russia. I think the second piece of evidence I read in the NR said that China would also fill in because of economic interests. That's the warranting.
Okay, got it. Sounds good. On the case page, you talk about how U.S. involvement, you again make another fill-in argument. I guess, when has this historically happened? When we have pulled out of Afghanistan, has Russia filled into that region?
Yeah, so that's not the main argument, because what happened in Afghanistan is just an example of democratic backsliding. So the reason why Russia didn't fill in Afghanistan is because a group like the Taliban stepped in immediately. So one oppressive government took it over before Russia came in. But my evidence clearly outlines that Russia is not only in regions like in the West Asia region, but also in North Africa, where they already have established minimal presence in 23 countries and are already trying to destabilize democracy. And the only thing stopping that is the US presence being there, and A, being a perceptual enough threat to deter Russia, but B, also having physical military presence to like help with foreign assistance programs.
That sounds good. I'll take running prep time starting now.
Great.
Alright, that was about 1 minute exactly of prep. The order will be the affirmative case and then the negative court case in the same order, authoritarianism and then the Houthi argument, and then just some weighing at the end.
Great.
You good to go?
Yeah.
Good to go? The quote from the 1NC that will decide this debate is full withdrawal. Their evidence and all their arguments are in the context of a full US military withdrawal, and that is not what the affirmative defends. We defend 50%, and that is key on all of their arguments. We'll get into it later. We agree on framework, and we will prove that the affirmative maximizes expected well-being. To provide an overview on the affirmative case, there are two contentions. First is conflict. Subpoint A is that US presence causes anti-US sentiment because we are literally torturing civilians, bombing schools, weddings, and funerals. That's the English news evidence. This incentivizes terror and perpetuates the killing. Subpoint B tells us that military presence precludes productive infrastructural development because it keeps West Asian countries over-securitized with military presence and constant surveillance. That ensures that people will be locked in conflict. But second is the economy. Subpoint A forwards that US spending on military expansion stops the funding of education and public health, which comes to a detriment of every citizen. But subpoint B is also clear that this causes deficit spending, which increases debt, that triggers a recession because of which would lead to mass starvation and suffering. We'll go on line by line now. Under Weschler evidence, this says that US presence is key to stability, but that's from 2021. That's before massive conflicts in Gaza, strikes on the Houthis, and killing civilians in over 10 countries. The affirmative, again, only defends a reduction of 50%, which means presence is still there. This is not an offensive argument or even a unique argument that's contextual to the affirmative. But they also say that counter-terror operations are successful now, but that doesn't account for trade-offs. Sure, we may take out some terrorists sometimes, but if we take 1,000 civilians with them, that's not worth it. Their argument that the AF increases conflict is also not in the context of a full withdrawal. On the second contention, they say that deficit spending has no impact, but our second piece of evidence in the contention is clear that it will cause recession because we will eventually get to a point where we can't raise the debt ceiling. They say that money won't get diverted, but senators have actively tried right now and are just waiting for diversions to happen. Now on their authoritarianism argument. Their entire argument relies on the fact that China and Russia will move into the Middle East if we leave and create authoritarian regimes, but this isn't true. Writer John Hawken tells us in 2021 that US officials have begun raising the alarm over Moscow or Beijing filling the void if Washington were to withdraw. Concerns are misguided. Neither Russia nor China is capable of filling the US void, nor do they desire to. Moscow and Beijing have not challenged the US security order, and Russia or China are opportunists, not revisionists. Doomsday predictions fail to account for limitations. Russia and China would have to assume a far more direct presence, yet both countries are highly adverse to creating that security order. But 2, Russia is too distracted in Ukraine to have the resources to do anything to fill in. But 3, it literally can't get worse. They have conceded the English news evidence that says the US is torturing people now, which seems pretty authoritarian to me. But on the Houthi ICBM's argument, there are 4 key arguments. 1, the AF is not a removal again, which means missile defense systems will still remain in place. But 2, attacks on shipping lanes have been happening for decades. Strikes in the Strait of Hormuz prove that attacks don't significantly impact shipping. But also 3, their own evidence says that with military presence in the status quo, strikes in the Strait of Hormuz, have literally occurred with ballistic missiles. That means military presence isn't doing anything. But their evidence is old. It doesn't account for the attacks from last night. According to CNN from today, quote, the rebels' spokesperson said the airstrikes would not deter further Houthi attacks on shipping. This proves that offensive attacks against the Houthis don't do anything to prevent attacks on shipping, which means their argument is non-unique. But it also means that US presence makes it worse. It has emboldened the Houthis to prove that they are credible, which makes attacks worse, which means the affirmative is net better. Under utilitarian calculus, this debate is one in which the app wins because they have conceded the base claim that military presence is a self-fulfilling prophecy. This means that a continuation of conflict precludes further development. Conflict outweighs their authoritarianism arguments because it means hundreds of thousands die. And their RCBM arguments are outdated, which means any risk that debt hurts the US population is a reason to vote affirmative. Voting AF solves something we know is killing people now. A vote for the neg is a vote in which the status quo is maintained, where we torture prisoners and everyone else in the region.
Okay, I have...
Minute 51.
Thank you. I was going to do the math. I'll start that now.
This time.
Okay. Yeah.
Sorry, do you want my stand? Sorry.
Oh, that would be great. I don't mind.
Sorry.
Thank you so much.
You're good.
Okay, so let me just set it down. Order of my speech is going to be, I'm going to go down the affirmative, or down the negative, down the affirmative, a little bit of weighing, and a couple of key voting issues. Does that sound good to everybody? Great. I'll start time on my first word. At the top On the negation, there's a fundamental understanding here where my opponent says that I'm advocating for full withdrawal. I'm not. If there's a substantial decrease in U.S. forces, that would be bad enough to trigger the neg impacts anyways, and my evidence accounts for that. But let's go to the first contention on a Russian fill-in. I tell you that right now Russia is seeking to erode democracy in the region. That's really dangerous because they have little presence in 23 countries, and this presence would be able to wreak all havoc if the U.S. pulls out and gives them full control. But then I also tell you that this is really dangerous because they're able to spread more authoritarianism, which has more human rights abuses, which is overall on net more dangerous for civilians and has less of like a good impact for societal welfare. My opponent tells you that Russia and China won't fill in because they're revisionists, but they have economic interests in the region. Remember, my evidence clearly tells you that their economic interest would prompt them to fill in, which means as long as they have some interest in the region and the U.S. pulls out, they have free range to do so. But second, my evidence or my analysis saying that if there's any risk of neg impacts triggering, you still pull the trigger there is entirely dropped, where I tell you if there's any risk of Russia filling in, you would still pull the trigger because that would be infinitely worse than the U.S. being in the region. But then they say that the U.S. is terrorizing people right now, but we would say that the U.S. is the only form of deterrence in the region. That means foreign assistance programming and military that's actually checking back against Russia is the only way to ensure that an actual authoritarian government doesn't go in and spread authoritarian ideals and oppress its people, unlike a democratic government like the U.S. being a lot better for like presence in the region generally. But then he says that Russia is distracting Ukraine. No, my evidence clearly outlines that these are private military groups that are backed by Russia. These are not the forces that are in Ukraine, but forces like the Wagner group that are backed by Russia with funding, which means it happens in either world. But then go to my second contention on trade, where I tell you that the Houthis are increasing attacks with ballistic missile defense right now. That is increasingly dangerous because using ballistic missiles is dangerous because no other country in the region has ballistic missile defense other than the U.S. That means the U.S. is key to deterrence. Otherwise, the Houthis get full access to the trade routes with ballistic missiles, which obviously have a lot more harm than simple attack drones that were used in the past. We would also see that this would lead to the impact of a recession, where I tell you that like attack on 30% of world trade through the Red Sea would increase inflation and also increase the prices of goods, which triggers my Zahn evidence, which indicates a wage price spiral, which means that workers have to demand higher raises in order to set off the price increases, which overall creates a self-running cycle of inflation and launches into the recession, which McKinnis terminalizes, would push 90 million people into poverty. My opponent just says that the attacks don't impact shipping and haven't had much of an impact, but my evidence also clearly outlines that the first time we saw ballistic missiles used was this week. Obviously, it hasn't had a lot of impact yet. It was like 2 days ago, but then we would say that they say that military presence only decreases substantially, so the bases still exist. You can't just fiat that all U.S. military bases still stay in the region when we pull out substantially. Either way, substantial is still a significant amount to give the Houthis more access, which is still going to be some offense on an impact, but also we would say that the perception of pulling out is bad anyways because the Houthis have more control if they see that the U.S. is drawing back troops. But then he says that the rebel spokesperson said last night that U.S. offense isn't deterring them and they're just going to keep doing bad things. Remember what I tell you, that of course people use this rhetoric saying that the U.S. made them do it, but they'll do it in either world. The only difference is, are we deterring or are we pulling out and let all chaos like wreak loose? But then he says that it's old evidence, but all of my evidence is about attacks from this week, and then he says the U.S. presence makes it worse and the attacks shouldn't have broken out in the first place. My argument is not the U.S. stops attacks from breaking out, but my argument is that the U.S. checks back and keeps some form of deterrence in the region, which is key to make sure that the neg impacts don't trigger. But then, even if you buy everything the app says, you're still preferring the neg for 4 key reasons. First, you vote on risk of neg. If there's any risk of a Russian fill-in or a potential recession, you negate to prevent the suffering that this would impose under the framework that we both agree on. But second, on magnitude and scope, recession overall outweighs, and we would say that authoritarian regimes can hurt 23 countries in the region. That's a pretty big amount of people that would be more terrorized than what's happening in the status quo. But then, on time frame, the attacks are already happening right now, which means this is the cleanest link and the most probable impact in today's round, where I tell you that the countries are already trying to seize control right now, and the only form of deterrence is the U.S. If we remove that, we see full control by these other terrorist groups. But then, go down the AF. First, my opponent says that my evidence, the Weschler evidence, is from 2021. It doesn't matter. 5 other cards are still dropped that I'll extend. First, my Weschler evidence of 2019 says that a Russia fill-in would increase conflict and instability as a battle for a new security order would ensue, creating a power vacuum. Thus, the Cropsey evidence, which is a power vacuum, would be detrimental to the people in the region because it creates a political vacuum for other countries to fill in and take control. But then, on my terrorism evidence, he just says that it's not worth it if we kill like thousands, but my Mount Slaughter evidence tells you that anti-terrorism has decreased 87% of deaths since 2016. That is fundamental evidence that is dropped in today's round. If the U.S. is preventing 87% of deaths caused by terrorist attacks, you obviously would negate to keep that good trend going. But then my Sullivan and Koch evidence is also dropped, which says that intervention incomes are successful over 60% of the time. 60% of the time that the U.S. fills in, intervention incomes or outcomes are successful. But then go down to the Bomahani evidence that just says in an empirical study, on average, states are less likely to enter war and begin conflict when there is U.S. troop presence. But then, on the idea of a self-fulfilling cycle, remember where I tell you that there's no implication as to why this actually matters in the status quo. It's better to have a U.S. presence than a Russian fill-in or no deterrence at all. Also, it's a very weak link. Why would the U.S. be increasing conflict when the main objective is to deter? But then go to the second contention. Overall, my opponent only gives you one response where they say that senators are trying right now. A, there's no evidence presented for this, but B, remember where I tell you that Biden is already forgiving billions of dollars in student loans and other things that should have hiked up the debt ceiling increasingly, but we didn't see a recessionary impact. That means you can't grant them their recessionary impact at all whatsoever. And then on the idea of the debt ceiling going up really high, you can't prove where this trades off from. And on the argument of public health and education, my opponent tells you himself that these are very, very unclearly outlined impact scenarios. You don't know what you're voting for here. He just says that it might increase or might hurt some people, or you would have other harms. But again, there's no direct causal analysis here as to why the U.S. pulling out actually affects this, and there's no clear impact scenario whatsoever to vote on. You prefer the neg where I give you clear-cut impact scenarios. That's the first place you're voting today, which is solvency. If a house is burning, you don't just sit back and watch it burn, you actually try to stop and put out the fire. That's what U.S. military is doing. They're in the region and actually solving things. If you pull out, we have no solvency whatsoever and give other actors full control of the power vacuum. The second place you're voting today is generally on impacts. Remember the way where I tell you that my opponent doesn't have a single clear-cut impact scenario in today's round. To save lives, you're going to be negating.
All right. I'll take the 3 minutes remaining.
Oh, did you say?
Yeah, no, you're fine. Thank you. All right, that was about time. The order will be a quick overview, the affirmative case, and then the negative case, and some weighing at the end. Sound good?
Yeah.
Good. If the house is burning, you don't just let it burn. The Houthis launching ICBMs and the US torturing civilians kind of sounds like a burning house to me. A vote for the negative is a vote for the status quo, which means their two and our arguments are a walking contradiction. First, their time frame weighing proves that the AF is uniquely key. They see that people are dying now, but a vote for the negative does nothing to resolve that. People continue to die in the world of the negative. The world of the affirmative is the only way to change it, and that proves the affirmative is try or die. But two, the assumptions they make are actively harmful. The US is not always democratic. We are not this magical peacekeeping force that ensures that everything goes swell. And that is an assumption that means millions of deaths in the Middle East. I will repeat this last argument again because it's the most important argument in the debate. The affirmative is not a full withdrawal. They say their evidence accounts for it, but it doesn't. That's proven by quotes in the 1NC, but also this means that deterrence against the Houthis can still happen and Russia would be deterred from filling in. We'll give a brief overview on the affirmative. First is conflict. They say that anti-US sentiment is not caused by military presence, but our English news evidence is really good about the way that US sentiment has started since we've gone into the Middle East. It's good about the way that killing civilians is bad, and killing civilians causes anti-US sentiment. And subpoint B tells us that the self-fulfilling prophecy is true. They just say it's an argument with no implication, but it has a clear implication. The implication is that if we don't leave, conflict will continue to perpetuate itself and continue to happen. But also the economy argument. The Twin Arabs didn't really do much work on this. They just forwarded their own scenario. But subpoint A is that US spending on military expansion stops the funding of education, public health, which comes to the detriment of every citizen. But subpoint B is clear that spending is deficit, which causes a recession because it means we don't account for debt. On the authoritarianism argument, they concede the John Hawken evidence, which tells you that one, Russia and China are opportunists, two, Russia and China would have to assume a more direct presence than they want to, and both countries are highly averse to doing so, which ends the fill-in argument. But the app is not a full reduction, which means 50% of presence would still be there to deter fill-in. Russia is not just going to walk into places like Syria or Iraq if the US is still there, but Ukraine proves that they don't have the resources. But also on the Houthi ICBMs, the most important piece of evidence is the CNN evidence, which proves that US force against the Houthis reinforced Houthi advances. Quote from the spokesperson, airstrikes would not deter further Houthi attacks, and they committed to attacking more. That proves that the negative makes it worse, a world in which we attack makes it worse. Under utilitarian calculus, the affirmative wins because we stop conflict that's happening now. But there is no negative offense. They say any risk of negative solvency is enough to erode negative. That makes absolutely no sense. If we prove the affirmative is a good idea, as set out by the burden at the beginning of this debate, that should be sufficient. The negative is a good idea. The house is burning. The affirmative is the only action. It's the only way to put it out. They haven't done any weighing, really, at all, which means that you're voting affirmative. Great debate.
Great round. Thank you for judging.